In November 1621, 53 English settlers and about 90 Wampanoag warriors sat down together for 3 days of feasting in Plymouth Colony. What was actually on that table would shock every American family gathered around a Thanksgiving turkey today. No pumpkin pie, no cranberry sauce, no mashed potatoes, not even bread stuffing. Number 17 on this list is something modern Americans would not recognize as food, and number 3 was literally dragged into camp by the Wampanoag as a gift. William Bradford wrote about it in his own hand. Edward Winslow sent a letter back to England describing the meal in detail. Historians have been piecing together the real story for 400 years. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what these pilgrims actually ate will change how you see Thanksgiving forever. Let's count down the 25 foods at the real first Thanksgiving. Number 25, watercress. Before lettuce came over from England in any reliable quantity, the pilgrims walked down to the freshwater streams running off Coles Hill and gathered watercress by the handful. It grew thick in the shallows, peppery and bright, the kind of green that reminded them of home. Edward Winslow mentioned the abundance of salad herbs in his letters back to England, and watercress was the most common of the lot. The Wampanoag had been eating it for generations, calling it by a name the English could not pronounce. It cost nothing, required no cooking, and delivered vitamin C at a time when scurvy had already killed half the Mayflower's original passengers. A bowl of chopped watercress with a splash of malt vinegar from the ship's stores would have been the closest thing to a modern salad on that harvest table. Nobody thought it was fancy. It was just there. Number 24, wild leeks. Also called ramps, these pungent green stalks pushed up through the New England soil in spring, but the bulbs could be dug year-round. Pilgrims quickly learned from the Wampanoag to follow the scent, almost garlic crossed with onion, to find patches hidden under fallen leaves. They roasted them in the embers of the cooking fires until the outer layer blackened and the inside turned silky and sweet. At the 1621 feast, wild leeks likely seasoned the venison and the fowl, mashed into the cavity before roasting. The English had cultivated leeks back in Europe, so this felt familiar. But the wild American version was stronger, sharper, and far more abundant. You could gather a week's worth in an hour. Number 23, walnuts. American black walnuts grew wild in the forests around Plymouth, and the Wampanoag had been cracking them open for centuries with stones. These were nothing like the mild English walnuts the Pilgrims knew. Black walnuts had a deep, almost bitter richness, and the shells were so hard they could dull an axe. At the first Thanksgiving, women likely spent hours sitting by the fire, smashing them open and picking out the meat. The oil from crushed walnuts was drizzled over roasted squash, and the chopped nuts were stirred into cornmeal porridge. A Wampanoag woman could process about a pound of walnut meat in a full afternoon. That was labor, nobody wasted. Every kernel got eaten or saved. Number 22, chestnuts. Here's something modern Americans will never taste the way the Pilgrims did. The American chestnut, before the 1904 blight wiped it out, was the king of the eastern forest. Some trees grew 100 feet tall and produced bushels of sweet, starchy nuts every fall. In 1621, chestnuts were so common, the Wampanoag dried them, ground them into flour, and stored them for winter in underground pits. Pilgrims roasted them whole in the coals, peeled off the leathery skin, and ate them warm. They tasted sweeter and less mealy than the European chestnut, almost like sweet potato. When the blight destroyed 4 billion American chestnut trees in the early 1900s, a flavor that had defined colonial New England cooking for 300 years simply disappeared. You cannot buy it today at any price. Number 21. Acorns. This is where things get interesting. First pattern break. Americans today do not think of acorns as food, but the Wampanoag had acorn processing down to a science, and the Pilgrims were hungry enough to learn fast. Raw acorns are loaded with tannins, so bitter they will make you gag. But the Wampanoag taught them to crack the shells, boil the meat in multiple changes of water, or bury the acorns in a mesh basket in a running stream for a week. The result was a mild, slightly sweet meal that could be ground into flour. At the first Thanksgiving, acorn flour was probably mixed with cornmeal to stretch the harvest. A single white oak could drop 500 pounds of acorns in a good year. That was more food than a cow could produce, and it required no farming at all. Number 20. Wild plums. Beach plums grew in tangled thickets along the Cape Cod shoreline, small purple fruits no bigger than a grape, tart enough to make your mouth pucker. The Pilgrims gathered them in September and dried them in the sun on flat rocks, turning them into something like a prune that would last through winter. At the November feast, these dried plums were probably stewed in a pot with a little of the precious sugar the ship had carried from England, creating something between a compote and a jam. Children at the table got the softest ones first. A handful of beach plums had more vitamin C than anything else the Pilgrims could preserve, and the Wampanoag had been trading them inland for generations. Number 19. Wild grapes. Captain John Smith had written about New England's wild grapes a decade before the Mayflower even sailed, describing vines so heavy with fruit they pulled down the trees they climbed. By September 1621, the Pilgrims had discovered these grapes themselves. Small, dark, intensely flavored. Nothing like the mild table grapes they had left behind. At the harvest feast, fresh grapes were piled in wooden bowls. Some were pressed into a rough wine that Bradford called very sweet and strong. The skins were thick and the seeds were enormous, but the juice was concentrated enough to stain your hands for days. Wampanoag hosts likely brought baskets of grapes as a contribution to the meal, a fruit so common nobody would have counted them. Number 18. Cranberries. Yes, cranberries were there, but not how you are thinking. There was no cranberry sauce. The Pilgrims did not have enough sugar to waste on sweetening a naturally sour berry, and they would not for another 50 years. What they did have was a bright red wild berry the Wampanoag called sasumuniash, growing in the bogs around Plymouth. At the feast, cranberries were probably crushed and mixed with cornmeal, added to venison stew for tartness, or dried whole, and added to pemmican-style travel food. The Wampanoag used them medicinally too, for urinary issues and as a dye. The idea of a gelatinous red log shaped like a can did not exist until 1912. In 1621, a cranberry was just a sharp, sour little berry that balanced out fatty meat. Number 17. Jerusalem artichokes. This one sounds made up, but it is real, and the Pilgrims called them sunroots. These knobby tubers from a native sunflower plant grew wild in clearings across New England, and the Wampanoag had been digging them for centuries. You could eat them raw, crunchy, and slightly sweet, like a water chestnut, or roast them in the coals until they turned tender and nutty. At the first Thanksgiving, Jerusalem artichokes were almost certainly served alongside the venison. The Pilgrims shipped samples back to Europe within a decade, and by 1630 they were growing in Paris gardens under a French name. Here is the kicker. Jerusalem artichokes are not from Jerusalem, and they are not artichokes. The name is a corruption of the Italian word for sunflower. Americans forgot how to love them somewhere around 1900. Number 16. Ground nuts, not peanuts. This is a second pattern break. These are something completely different. The Wampanoag called them hopnis, small brown tubers from a native vine that tasted somewhere between a potato and a chestnut. William Bradford wrote that ground nuts literally saved the Pilgrim colony during the starving winter of 1620 to 1621. The Wampanoag showed the colonists how to dig the tubers with sharpened sticks, boil them until soft, and eat them mashed with a little salt. By the first Thanksgiving in November, ground nuts were a staple food, and baskets of them almost certainly sat on that harvest table. Here is what nobody tells you. When European potatoes arrived in New England decades later, they pushed ground nuts off the menu completely. The plant still grows wild along creek banks from Maine to Florida. Americans walk past a food that kept their ancestors alive every single day. Number 15. Indian corn. This was not sweet corn. It was not yellow. The maize the Wampanoag grew in their fields was flint corn, with hard kernels in every color, from deep red to blue to white. You could not eat it off the cob. By November, it had been dried on the stalk and stored in underground pits lined with grass. At the first Thanksgiving, corn appeared in almost everything. It was ground into coarse meal and boiled into porridge. It was parched whole and eaten like popcorn. It was simmered with beans into succotash. The Wampanoag had been growing maize for at least 500 years before the Pilgrims arrived, and Tisquantum, the man history calls Squanto, taught the settlers to plant it with a dead fish in each hole for fertilizer. Without Indian corn, there would have been no feast at all. Number 14. Stewed pompion. Forget pumpkin pie. In 1621, the Pilgrims had no pastry flour, very little butter, almost no sugar, and no oven. What they did have was pumpkin, lots of it, which they called pompion. The Wampanoag had been growing native pumpkins and winter squash for centuries, and the harvest was enormous that fall. At the first Thanksgiving, pompion was cut into chunks, stewed in a pot with water and maple sap, if any was still around, and served soft and sweet as a side dish. Some accounts suggest the Pilgrims also hollowed out whole small pumpkins, filled the cavity with milk, honey, and spices, and roasted them whole in the hot ashes. That dish became a New England colonial favorite for over a century. The pie came much later. You are loving this so far. I put together a cookbook with 100 simple traditional meals you can actually make at home. The link is right below this video. Number 13. Nas UMP. This was pure Wampanoag cooking. Nasa UMP was a thick porridge made from dried, pounded corn, boiled in a clay pot with whatever was available: berries, nuts, small pieces of meat, wild onions, and maple sugar. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the Wampanoag, and at the 1621 feast, pots of nasomp sat next to the fires, being topped up constantly over 3 days of eating. The texture was somewhere between grits and polenta, and the flavor changed depending on what got thrown in that hour. When the Wampanoag arrived with their contributions, they brought cooking pots of nasomp that had been simmering for hours. Pilgrim children reportedly ate it faster than the adults. It was warm, filling, and sweet in a way nothing European had tasted. Number 12. Samp was cracked corn, coarser than cornmeal but finer than whole kernels, boiled for hours with water until it turned into a thick, milky mush. The Pilgrims added cream when they had it, salt when they didn't. The Wampanoag added bear fat or deer fat for richness. At the first Thanksgiving, samp was probably served as the foundation of several dishes, a base that soaked up the juices from venison and fowl. Roger Williams wrote a few years later that samp was the quick, rich feeding of New England. It filled stomachs cheaply and kept bodies warm through the long winter. A wooden bowl of hot samp with a spoonful of goose fat was a complete meal by itself. Number 11. Journey cake. The ancestor of the American pancake, the Johnny cake, and the Southern hoe cake are all traced back to this simple bread from 1621. The Pilgrims ground dried corn into a coarse meal, mixed it with water and a pinch of salt, and cooked the batter on a flat stone heated in the fire. Some say the name came from journey cake because it traveled well and would not spoil. Others claim it is a corruption of Shawnee cake. Either way, it showed up at the first Thanksgiving because there was no wheat flour for proper bread. These rough corn cakes were thick, slightly gritty, and delicious when slathered with venison drippings. Pilgrim women could cook a stack of 20 in under an hour. Every meal for years started with a journey cake in hand. Number 10. Mussels. Plymouth Bay was crawling with shellfish in 1621, and mussels clung to every rock along the shore in clusters thick enough to harvest with your bare hands. The Pilgrims had arrived hungry, and shellfish saved them. At the first Thanksgiving, mussels were steamed open over the fire in large iron pots, the shells clacking as they opened. Winslow specifically mentioned shellfish in his letter describing the feast, and mussels were the most abundant. The Wampanoag considered them almost too easy to bother with. A beginner's food, but the English could not get enough. A bushel of mussels could be gathered in 20 minutes at low tide. They were salty, briny, and free, and they went perfectly with the cornmeal journey cakes for dipping. Number 9. Clams. Third pattern break. This is where the menu gets truly alien to modern Thanksgiving tables. Soft-shell clams, what New Englanders now call steamers, were so abundant on the Plymouth shoreline that the Pilgrims could dig a bushel in an hour. The Wampanoag called them quahog and had been eating them for thousands of years, roasting them in pits lined with hot stones and seaweed, a technique that became the modern New England clam bake. At the 1621 feast, clams were steamed in their shells and served by the basket. The broth left behind in the pots became the base for stews. Pilgrim children reportedly fought over the largest ones. In an era before refrigeration, clams were the one protein you could gather in the morning and eat by noon without any risk. Number 8. Lobster. Americans today think of lobster as a luxury. In 1621, lobster was peasant food, so common that the Pilgrims were slightly embarrassed to serve it. William Bradford later complained in his journal about having to offer lobster to guests for want of bread and victuals. At the first Thanksgiving, lobsters were piled on the tables, some reportedly weighing 5 pounds or more. The Wampanoag had been trapping them in stone weirs along the coast for centuries. Pilgrims cooked them whole in boiling seawater, cracked them open with rocks, and ate the meat with their fingers. There was so much lobster in Plymouth Bay that they were used as fertilizer for crops and as bait for fishing. It would take 200 years before lobster became expensive. In 1621, it was Tuesday dinner. Number 7. EEL. This one's going to surprise you. Tisquantum, the Wampanoag man the Pilgrims called Squanto, specifically taught the settlers how to catch eels in Plymouth Brook, and eel was reportedly one of the first good meals the starving colonists ate after the brutal winter. Winslow described the process in detail in his letters. You walked into the shallow water at night with a torch, felt for the eels buried in the mud with your feet, and pulled them out by hand. At the first Thanksgiving, fresh eels were smoked over green wood fires, turning their flesh a rich caramel color, and giving them a flavor somewhere between salmon and bacon. English settlers already knew eel from home, but American eels were fatter, longer, and more abundant. A good night of eeling could feed a family for a week. Number 6. Striped bass. Plymouth Bay was so full of striped bass in 1621 that John Smith claimed you could walk across the water on their backs during the spring run. The Wampanoag caught them in enormous nets made from twisted plant fibers, and the Pilgrims quickly adopted the same technique. At the first Thanksgiving, striped bass was roasted whole on green wood spits over the open fire, the skin crisping while the flesh underneath turned tender and flaky. Some bass weighed over 30 pounds. Winslow specifically mentioned great store of wildfowl and venison in his account, but the fish were so routine he barely bothered to detail them. Pilgrim records from the following year show striped bass being salted and stored in barrels by the hundreds. It was the cod of New England before cod took over. Number 5. Passenger pigeon. Fourth pattern break. Americans will never see what the Pilgrims saw. When flocks of passenger pigeons passed overhead in 1621, they darkened the sky for hours, sometimes days. Billions of birds, so thick you could knock them out of the air with a long stick. At the first Thanksgiving, passenger pigeons were almost certainly served alongside the other wildfowl, roasted on spits in groups of 10 or more. The breasts were plump, the meat was dark and rich, and they cost absolutely nothing to harvest. A single pilgrim with a net could catch 100 pigeons in a single afternoon during migration. By 1914, the passenger pigeon was extinct. The last one, named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. A species that once numbered 5 billion was wiped out in less than a century by the same colonial mindset that treated them as an inexhaustible feast. Number 4. Wild turkey. Here's the shocker. Turkey might not have been the star of the first Thanksgiving at all. Edward Winslow's letter mentions fowl in general terms, but never specifically turkey. William Bradford wrote 20 years later that there was great store of wild turkeys in the area, which is probably where the myth started. What we know for sure is that wild turkeys existed in Plymouth. They weighed up to 25 pounds, and they were hunted with muskets. If turkey was served, it was roasted on a spit for hours, stuffed not with bread, but with onions, chestnuts, and herbs. The flesh was darker and gamier than any supermarket turkey today. But the idea that turkey was the centerpiece of the meal did not become official until 1863, when Sarah Josepha Hale convinced Abraham Lincoln to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, 242 years later. Number 3. Wild duck and goose. This is where the real fowl story lives. Winslow specifically wrote that the men went fowling for 3 days before the feast, and what they brought back was mostly ducks and geese, not turkey. The marshes around Plymouth teemed with migrating waterfowl every November: mallards, black ducks, Canada geese, even swans. At the first Thanksgiving, these birds were plucked, gutted, and roasted whole on spits over open fires, their fat dripping into pans below to be saved for cooking later. Duck and goose meat is far richer than turkey, darker, fattier, more intensely flavored. Pilgrim children probably ate more duck that week than they had seen in their entire lives in England, where wildfowl was reserved for the gentry. In 1621, anyone with a musket could eat like a king. Number 2. Sobaheg. This was the Wampanoag contribution that changed everything. Sobaheg was a deep, dark, long-simmered stew made with whatever meat was available, usually venison, with chunks of dried corn, beans, squash, sunflower seeds, and wild onions, all cooking together in a clay pot for most of a day. By the time it reached the table at the first Thanksgiving, the meat had fallen apart and the broth had turned almost black with concentrated flavor. Massasoit's men likely brought several pots of Sobaheg as their contribution to the three-day feast. The Pilgrims had never tasted anything like it. English stews were thin and watery compared to this. The combination of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, simmered with wild game, was the defining dish of Wampanoag cooking. Many food historians now argue Sobaheg was the single most important dish on that 1621 table. Number 1. Venison. This was the centerpiece, not the turkey. Winslow's letter states it plainly. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit arrived with 90 warriors, and after realizing they had doubled the size of the gathering, sent hunters out who returned with 5 deer. 5 entire deer. That's roughly 700 pounds of meat. The venison was butchered on the spot and roasted in enormous cuts over open pits, the largest cooking for 12 hours or more. The flesh was basted with its own fat, seasoned with salt from the ship's stores and wild herbs from the Wampanoag, and served in heaping platters throughout the 3 days. Venison was the protein that fed everyone, the dish that made the feast a feast rather than a meager harvest meal. Here's the wild part. The Wampanoag's gift of 5 deer was not just generous, it was diplomatic. It was Massasoit telling the Pilgrims that his people would share the land and its abundance, at least for now. That relationship held for 50 years before it collapsed into King Philip's War. But on those 3 days in November 1621, around fires burning down to coals, English farmers and Wampanoag hunters shared venison from the same animals, drank from the same wooden cups, and ate from the same tables. It was the most important meal in American history, and the main course was deer. Here's my challenge to you. This Thanksgiving, try one of these dishes, just one. Stewed pumpkin with maple syrup, roasted chestnuts from the coals, nasump porridge with dried cranberries. Then tell me in the comments if it changed how you think about Thanksgiving. Because the truth is, the meal we celebrate every year is almost nothing like the meal that actually happened. We replaced venison with turkey. We replaced Sobaheg with green bean casserole. We replaced nasump with stuffing from a box. And somewhere in that swap, we forgot the story. If you want the full collection of traditional recipes made simple, I put together a cookbook with 100 meals you can actually cook at home. The link is in the description below. The Pilgrims knew. The Wampanoag knew. Now you know too.